Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be looking at a connection you might not have thought of before,
Okay.
autism and dissociation.
Interesting.
Yeah, and we're diving into this blog post from Cheap ABA.
Okay.
It's called Autism and Dissociation, Unpacking the Complexities of Trauma Response. And it really got me thinking about, we often focus on like the external challenges of autism,
Right.
but what about the internal experience? What's that like?
Yeah, that's such a good point. And what's interesting is that dissociation, which is that feeling of disconnect
Right.
from yourself or your surroundings, can actually be more frequent in autistic people.
Okay, that's really interesting. The blog post mentions a couple of reasons why that might be. One that I hadn't connected before was sensory overload,
Uh-huh.
which we often associate with autism, but I hadn't thought about it in terms of dissociation.
Yeah, well, it's not just about loud noises either.
Right.
The blog post mentions a study that found that autistic individuals showed significantly heightened brain activity in response to sensory stimuli. Oh, wow.
Compared to neurotypical individuals.
Yeah.
So even things like fluorescent lights or certain textures
Yeah.
can be so intensely overwhelming that the brain just kind of checks out as a way to cope.
That makes a lot of sense. Then there's also this whole concept of alexithymia and interoception,
Yes.
which the blog post dives into.
Yes. Alexithymia is that difficulty identifying and describing your emotions.
Okay.
And interoception is the awareness of internal bodily sensations.
Right.
So imagine you're feeling constantly out of touch with your own body and emotions.
Yeah.
It can create a persistent sense of detachment, which can make dissociation more likely.
It's like that feeling we all get sometimes where you're like, wait, am I hungry or am I anxious?
Right.
But like way more intense and more frequent.
Exactly.
The blog post also mentions prosopagnosia
Uh-huh.
or face blindness, and I thought that was really interesting too.
Absolutely. Prosopagnosia isn't just about forgetting names.
Right.
It's about potentially not recognizing familiar faces.
Which could make every social interaction feel new and unpredictable.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
Imagine the anxiety that could cause, especially for someone already navigating the social complexities of autism.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're starting to see how these aspects of autism can create a foundation where dissociation might be more likely.
Exactly.
And the blog post goes on to talk about specific triggers
Yes.
that might be particularly relevant for autistic individuals.
Right. And this is where it gets really interesting. We know about common trauma triggers,
Right.
but for people with autism, even everyday situations can become overwhelming.
Like what?
Well, remember that heightened sensitivity to sensory input we talked about.
Yeah.
Imagine like constant bombardment of sensory information in a crowded space,
Oh, yeah.
or dealing with unexpected changes in routine.
Right. It's like their whole sense of stability just gets thrown off.
The blog post uses this great analogy of a carefully built house of cards.
Oh, I remember that.
One wrong move and the whole thing collapses.
Yeah, that's a good one. And even positive social interaction, which a lot of people find energizing,
Right.
can be incredibly draining for someone on the autism spectrum.
Exactly.
So dissociation can become a way to kind of manage that social energy expenditure.
Yes, very much so.
So we've established some reasons why autistic people might dissociate more often,
Uh-huh.
but how does it actually manifest? Like, what does it look like?
Well, it can be quite varied,
Okay.
and that's part of what makes diagnosis tricky.
Right.
The blog post highlights a few key ways it might present itself.
So this is where it starts to get really nuanced.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One way is through flashbacks, but these aren't always like the PTSD flashbacks we might typically think of.
Okay.
The blog post mentions that for autistic individuals, flashbacks can be sensory or emotionally based.
Interesting.
For instance, a specific smell might trigger intense anxiety without a clear memory of a traumatic event.
Wow. So it's not necessarily about reliving a specific event, but more about a sensory or emotional experience that's triggering that dissociative response.
Exactly.
What are some other ways that it might present?
Another common manifestation is something called internal blankness.
Okay.
Think of it like brain fog, but much more persistent.
Got it.
The world feels distant, sounds might seem muffled, and it becomes difficult to engage.
I bet that's hard to explain.
It is. The blog post also talks about catatonia, which is a much rarer and more severe form of dissociation,
Okay.
where the person becomes almost completely unresponsive.
Wow.
It's important to mention because it can be mistaken for other conditions.
It sounds like diagnosing dissociation in autistic individuals can be pretty challenging.
It can? What are some of the factors that make it so tricky?
Well, one that comes to mind is this idea of masking. where autistic individuals try to suppress their autistic traits and blend in.
Exactly.
So they might be experiencing intense dissociation internally, but outwardly they appear fine.
It's like putting on a performance.
Yeah, it can be really hard to recognize what's going on beneath the surface.
Absolutely.
And I imagine communication challenges can also make it even more difficult for autistic individuals to articulate what they're experiencing.
You're absolutely right. The blog post points out that it's not just about verbal communication,
Right.
but about how autistic individuals experience and describe things which might be different from what's considered typical. They might
Right.
not use the expected emotional language, making it harder for others to understand what they're going through.
So there's a real need for like heightened awareness and understanding from healthcare providers and people who interact with autistic people.
Absolutely. And that's why resources like the one we're discussing today
Yeah.
from Autism Speaks are so important.
Yeah. The familiarity of Autism Speaks as an organization lends a lot of credibility to this information, which I think is really important when you're talking about a topic as complex and often misunderstood as this.
It's a great starting point for anyone wanting to delve deeper.
Yeah. And it highlights the importance of looking beyond outward behavior
Right.
and trying to understand the internal world of autistic individuals.
Because what we might perceive as aloofness or disinterest could actually be a manifestation of a really profound internal struggle.
It's a powerful reminder that there's always more than meets the eye.
Always.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening start to our deep dive. We've unpacked some of the key reasons why autistic people might dissociate more often, explored how it might manifest,
Yes.
and highlighted the challenges of diagnosis.
Yeah, I think it's really emphasized the importance of recognizing dissociation as a potential factor in the lives of autistic individuals.
Absolutely. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, there's one crucial point the source material raises that I think we should address.
Okay.
And it's about why this topic even matters to those of us who aren't autistic.
Right. Because at first glance, you might think this is only relevant to a specific group of people,
Right.
but the implications are much broader than that.
Exactly. So why should this matter to everyone?
Good question. Let's explore that further in part 2 of our deep dive.
Right. Sounds good.
Well, it challenges us to reconsider our assumptions
Yeah.
about how people behave and interact with the world. You know, we often judge based on external behavior without really understanding the internal experience.
Right. Like we see somebody and they seem aloof or even rude,
Right.
and we just make these snap judgments.
Exactly. But those behaviors could stem from intense internal struggles like dissociation that we're completely unaware of.
It's true. It's like everybody's fighting a battle we know nothing about.
Very true.
Really makes you think twice before jumping to conclusions.
Yeah. And this deep dive has really underscored for me how a little bit of empathy and understanding can go a long way.
You know, it's funny because when we first started talking about dissociation, I thought about it like a weakness or a flaw.
Yeah, that's a common misconception.
Yeah.
But as we've been exploring, dissociation is actually a defense mechanism.
It's like your brain going, we got to shut this down.
It's the brain's way of protecting itself from being completely overwhelmed.
Exactly. And when we think about it that way, it really shifts our perspective.
It does.
Yeah.
Think about it. We all have sensory experiences that we find unpleasant.
Oh, yeah. Like nails on a chalkboard.
Exactly. We recoil, we cringe. We might even feel a little dissociative in those moments.
I get chills.
Now imagine experiencing that level of intensity on a more regular basis.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
It really makes you want to be more understanding
Absolutely.
of what people might be going through.
It does, and it makes you wonder how many times have we misjudged someone's behavior
Right.
because we didn't understand those internal struggles that they might be facing.
So the next time we encounter someone who seems off or withdrawn,
Yeah.
we should consider the possibility that they're dealing with unseen struggles, like dissociation.
It could completely change how we interact with the world.
How so?
Instead of getting frustrated or judgmental, we might approach the situation with more compassion and understanding.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. I feel like we've just scratched the surface here. But I hope it sparked some curiosity in our listeners.
Absolutely. And, you know, if you're struggling with dissociation or any other mental health challenges, please reach out for help.
Yeah,
There are resources available.
definitely. We'll make sure to include links to some of those resources in the show notes.
It's important to remember that seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness.
Absolutely. So where do we go from here?
Mm.
We've talked about the why behind the connection between autism and dissociation. And we've touched on how this knowledge can impact our interactions with others.
Yes. But there's another layer I think that's worth exploring, and it's this idea that understanding dissociation in the context of autism can actually help us understand ourselves better, even if we're not on the spectrum.
Okay, that's interesting. What do you mean by that? So how does understanding dissociation in autistic people help us understand ourselves better?
Well, we've been talking about how dissociation can be a response to feeling overwhelmed.
Right, like our brain's just hitting the off switch.
Exactly. Now, even though most of us don't experience sensory overload to the same degree as someone on the autism spectrum,
Right.
we all have our own triggers.
Right, so you're saying like those moments when we zone out or feel spaced out
Yeah.
or just disconnected from what's going on around us,
hmm
those could be milder forms of dissociation that we all experience sometimes.
Precisely. And recognizing those moments and understanding what triggers them can actually give us valuable insight into our own emotional regulation
Okay.
and coping mechanisms.
So it's almost like by looking at the more pronounced experiences of dissociation in autism, we can start to understand and manage our own more subtle dissociative tendencies.
It's like holding up a magnifying glass to something that's already there, but we just might not have noticed it before.
Wow. That's a really cool way to think about it. I love that analogy.
Yeah.
It's like this deep dive has opened up a whole new way of looking at not just autism, but like the human experience in general.
And that's the power of knowledge, isn't it? It helps us understand the world and ourselves better.
It does.
Yeah.
So to bring it back to our listeners, what's the key takeaway here? What can people do with this new understanding of dissociation?
I think the biggest takeaway is awareness.
Okay.
Being aware of dissociation as a potential factor in how people behave, both those on the autism spectrum and those who aren't.
Right. And hopefully that awareness leads to more empathy and understanding in our interactions.
Exactly. Next time you encounter someone who seems withdrawn or disconnected,
Yeah.
remember that there might be more going on beneath the surface than you realize.
It's like a call to action to approach each other with a little more compassion
Yes,
and a little more curiosity.
absolutely.
This deep dive has been amazing. I've learned so much.
You too.
Thanks for walking us through all this.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.